This episode, I'm going to do something a little different. Most of the time on this podcast, I try to feature cases with the intent of keeping information out there that could maybe help solve a case. And I'll be honest, today's case doesn't have a very good chance of that. This case is almost 75 years old. The victim in it would be 88 years old if she were still alive today, and so her killer is almost certainly deceased. But the reason why I want to talk about it is because it's one of those pivotal examples of a young teen doing something so common during a decade our society is strangely nostalgic over nowadays, while also being a case that is riddled with things that make me want to shout from the rooftop, like, this young girl was more in danger in this situation back then than she would be now. And I plan to point out examples of that as we go. It wasn't just this picture-perfect 1950s safe society. It also has elements of other problematic concerns that ran rampant back then, such as racial profiling and trying to round up any black men they could find and pin these crimes on them. And unfortunately, that can still happen today. It's also another example of how sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who could hurt you. To better understand how we view our society and our safety in present-day society, it's important to understand these cases in history and how they shaped us and our perceptions. This particular case is considered the story from which a very famous urban legend is based off of. Sometimes it's called the Babysitter, or the Babysitter and the Man Upstairs. It originated in the 1960s, and it's been told around campfires and made into movies. Are you familiar? If not, there are many variations, but it essentially goes like this. A young teen is babysitting children. Usually the teen is watching TV after the kids go to bed when she starts receiving creepy phone calls. Oftentimes, the male voice on the other end says, "Have you checked the children?" The girl dismisses them as prank calls to start, but gets increasingly more frightened and calls police, who trace the calls and let her know the most famous line of all. The calls are coming from inside the house. The different versions have different endings and the outcomes, and I'm sure there will be another movie to come. But this young girl, Janett, her life was more than how it ended, and her violent ending shouldn't be reduced to a movie trope. Janett's last moments on Earth had to be filled with terror, and the actual story is scarier and more devastating than any movie I've ever seen. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Janett Christman. Janett Christman was born on March 21st, 1936 to Charles and Lula Mae Christman. In 1950, she was an 8th grader at Jefferson Junior High School in Columbia, Missouri. She was the oldest sibling, and she had a younger sister, Rita, who was close in age, just 18 months younger, and then a newborn baby sibling, Cheryl. The family had previously lived in Boonville, Missouri, but recently moved to the city of Columbia. Nowadays, Columbia is a mid-sized city with about 130,000 residents. It's a Midwest college town, home to the University of Missouri, and so it has a lot of what you'd expect in a college town: arts, culture, and good healthcare establishments. It's a reasonable drive to other big cities like St. Louis and Kansas City, and only about 30 miles from the capital, Jefferson City. The city is located near the Missouri River between the Ozark Plateau and Northern Plains. And while it was a college town back then too, it was much smaller, with only about 60,000 residents. Janett and her family lived on the second floor above their family business, Ernie's Cafe and Steakhouse. It was known at the time as being a place for couples to have a romantic dinner out, even featuring a date steak on their menu items for special occasions. The restaurant has changed ownership several times over the years, but it still exists in its original location in downtown Columbia to this day and is a well-known diner gem in the community. Janett was a hard worker who often babysat to earn money to buy the things that she wanted. At that moment, in March of 1950, she was saving up money to buy a burgundy-colored suit she wanted to wear for the upcoming Easter holiday. She also could have considered it an early birthday present to herself, as she would be turning 14 in just a few days. Two families she often babysat for were the Romack family and the Mueller family. On the morning of March 18, 1950, Ed Romack phoned Janett to see if she was available, and she agreed to take the job. The Romacks were friends with the Muellers, and they planned to go play cards that night at a social club called Moon Valley Villa. And so, not too long after the Romacks got a hold of Janett, the popular, responsible babysitter was phoned by the Muellers, but she let them know she already had committed to the Romacks that night. The Muellers must have had success with finding another sitter because the plans remained in place. That evening, Janett's school was having a school dance, and she was invited to attend with several friends, but she declined their invitations because she had her babysitting commitment. And the Romacks couldn't be more appreciative. They had only lived in Columbia for a short period of time, and the move had taken its toll on Mrs. Ann Romack, who was expecting the couple's second child. They were looking forward to a night out with friends and adult interaction. And I can so relate to that, because I remember when my kids were young and just wanting some adult time. Janett's father dropped her off at the Romacks' home at 1015 Stewart Road around 7:30 p.m. The home was on the outskirts of Columbia and much more isolated back then versus today. I'll have pictures of the area and the home on my Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. Janett would be watching the Romacks' 3-year-old son Greg, who was already settling in to sleep for the night. Ann Romack let Janett know that it should be a quiet night, despite the nasty weather outside. It was storming and very cold. She said that Greg was a solid sleeper who liked to sleep with the radio on. For his part of the briefing, Ed Romack took Janett over to the door where he kept his shotgun. He showed her how to load, unload, and fire it. He also instructed her to keep the door locked at all times and said that should anybody show up and come knocking, to turn the front porch light on so she could see out. And with that, the Romacks departed and met up with their friends. They planned to take advantage of the evening and stay out for a while, since they didn't know when they'd get the opportunity to do this again. Janett was fine with this, and the plan was for the Romacks to drive her home once they got home. The evening continued on, and it was a mostly quiet evening, besides the weather. The storm kept getting worse and worse. It was alternating between rain and sleet, and the rain was getting icy, and the wind was picking up, shaking the houses. With many people staying in because of the weather versus a typical Saturday night, the police line had been very quiet. Remember, this is pre-911, so if you had an emergency, you had to contact your local police department. And that's just what happened at around 10:35 p.m. The Boone County Sheriff's Office received a frantic call from a woman. At first, all they could hear was the sound of a woman loudly screaming. He tried to get any information he could, but the caller could only utter, "Come quick," before the phone call abruptly ended and a dial tone was heard. The officer on the other end of the line, a man named Ray McCowan, felt helpless. The call was too short to trace, and the caller had not provided any additional information. Even if it had been long enough to trace, the test board at the telephone company was not manned at that hour, so there would have been nobody there to trace the call. So he just had to hope the caller was able to call back and hope for the best. At 11 p.m., Ann Romack called home to check on how things were going. She knew the inclement weather was probably creating a lot of noise, and she was worried it may have awoken Greg. She got a busy signal, but didn't think too much of it. Possibly the weather was impacting the phone lines. Plus, they wanted to just stay out a bit longer. As they were Catholics during Lent, they were fasting, and they wanted to stay past the midnight hour so they could have some of the refreshments. At 1:15 a.m., the Romacks left to head home, and at 1:35 a.m., they arrived home. The weather had turned their driveway into a messy mud pile. As they got up towards the front door, they noticed the light on the front porch and the blinds wide open. And when Mr. Romack went to use his keys to get inside, he noticed the door was already unlocked, which confused him because he had told Janett before he left to lock up behind them and keep the door locked. And upon walking in, the Romacks found a horrible scene. There on the floor lay Janett. As a heads up and trigger warning, if you Google this case, there's a chance you will find very graphic crime scene photos. I unfortunately stumbled across them and they were pretty disturbing. They are actual photos of her dead. I'm not including any of them in my Instagram, and I'm only telling you so that you'll just be cautious. I know when I listen to episodes, I go and often research them further, so I just wanted, again, to give you the heads up. What I will share is some details of how she was found, and again, just a content warning as this includes some graphic details of the murder of a child. I'm sharing them because they are important in connection to other cases and suspects. And while we're on the subject of content warnings, I just want to also mention that later in this episode, we will be discussing intense racial profiling, including the execution of a possibly innocent Black man. So just wanted to give you a heads up about the discussion of racial violence during this time. Janett was lying on the carpeted living room floor in a pool of blood. It was obvious that she had a severe head injury. She also had a cord wrapped tightly around her neck and puncture marks on the side of her temples from a sharp instrument. She had other bruising and cuts on her head. Her shirt was still on, though her top was pushed up a small amount. Her legs were posed, spread apart, and her skirt pushed up. One of her shoes hung off her foot, and the other was off and nearby. Anne Romack understandably panicked and ran up the stairs to check on her son. Greg was unharmed and, amazingly, had slept through the violent struggle. Police would later on try to question the preschooler, and he just mentioned he was asleep the whole time. Just a few feet away from Janett's body was the phone hanging off the line. It was evident that she likely tried to make the phone call and was able to get through long enough just to scream for help, and then was overtaken by the perpetrator who disconnected the call and left the phone off the line. It was for this reason that Anne Romack was unable to get through when she tried calling at 11. Ed Romack put the phone back on the hook and then used it to call police, who responded quickly. From a jurisdictional point of view, the location of the Romack house was complicated. Lieutenant Joe Douglas from the City Police Department responded immediately, but technically the home was just outside the border of Columbia, a mere 100 yards, putting the crime scene under the oversight of the Boone County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Glenn Powell was first to respond from that front, and right away the power struggle took place and the two entities clashed. This would be a problem throughout the investigation. What all parties could agree on was that a violent struggle had taken place. There was blood smears and fingerprints found around the living room and kitchen and alongside the back door, which was unlocked and left ajar. Search dogs were brought in immediately, and they traced a scent for about a mile, up Stewart Road to West Boulevard and across West Ash Street before the scent was lost. The method of entry into the home was up for debate. Initially, it seemed like a clear case of forced entry. A side window had been broken out with a garden hoe, and a sawhorse was placed below the window. I'll have a picture of the window with the sawhorse on our Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. Below the window were men's shoe prints in the mud, which were photographed for evidence. But it was Mr. Romack who was quick to point out a problem with the intruder theory. The garden hoe was always kept inside their home in a utility closet, so it couldn't have been used to break in from the outside. This changed everything. Was this a setup to look like forced entry to throw off detectives? There were other clues that pointed to this too. The light being on was what Ed Romack had told Janett to do if somebody came to the door, and the shotgun was still just sitting there. So in this case, did Janett open the door to someone familiar that she trusted, only to be met with violence? The autopsy revealed that Janett had died from strangulation. A cord from the Romack's iron had been cut and used to manually strangle her. Being able to locate the iron in the Romack's house was another indication that this was somebody who had familiarity with the layout and items in the home. Janett had also been sexually assaulted, stabbed several times by what seemed to be a mechanical pencil, and hit over the head with a blunt object. Police reviewed the phone records and questioned the other 5 subscribers on the Romack's phone party line, and they found that the last call had been at 10:35 p.m., which aligned with the timeline of the call the police department had received. The response to the murder from the community and law enforcement was one of sheer panic. Police Chief Gene Pond immediately canceled all future requested days off for officers and mandated 12-hour overtime shifts. Prosecuting attorney Carl Sapp got on public radio and asked all employers in the Columbia area to alert them of anybody who called in sick the day after the murder or anyone who had fresh cuts or bandages. The city council held a private meeting on how to determine what, if anything, should be done. At least 25 men were pulled in to be interviewed as potential suspects, many of them black men who were brought in as a result of racial profiling. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Within just a couple of days, the community had pulled together a $1,600 reward for information. Much of the information, though, was young girls and women sharing their own stories of prowlers, peeping toms, and scary incidents in their own surrounding neighborhood. A woman who lived on Morningside Drive about 2 miles east of the Romack home said that a couple of weeks before the murder, on a warm night, she had decided to go sit on her back porch. When she opened the door to go back there, she saw a man standing on her back porch. When he saw her, he ran. She described him as a white man wearing a camel's hair overcoat. But even more disturbing was this account. On the night of Janett Christman's murder, a young woman named Sarah Johnson was babysitting at 42 West Boulevard, a mere half-mile and couple of blocks away from the Romack home. She said that she was babysitting there that evening when around 10 p.m. a man approached the back door and tried the handle. Finding it locked, he disappeared back out into the darkness. This would have been about a half hour before the call from Janett to police. The murder of a young babysitter would understandably shake up the nerves of any community. But there was good reason why this situation was even more concerning. This was not a new problem for this neighborhood in Columbia. This tiny portion of the community had been plagued with sexual assaults and attempted sexual assaults just a few months prior, and even a murder a few years prior. But in all those cases, someone was arrested, and so the community thought the issue was behind them. But with Janett's murder, now they had to consider, were the right men arrested for the other crimes, and were they still in imminent danger? Let's first rewind to 1946. A beautiful 20-year-old named Mary Lou Jenkins lived with her parents at the intersection of West Rollins Road and West Boulevard South, just a couple of blocks away from the Romack house. Her dad was temporarily living out of town in Kansas City for work, and her mother often worked as an overnight nurse for elderly neighbors next door. Mary Lou and her mother had a safety code as women feeling vulnerable on those overnights. If anything suspicious were to happen or the other needed help, the one needing help should turn on a light, open the blinds, and call the other as a sort of signal since the two homes were in view of one another. At 10 p.m. on Wednesday, February 5th, Mary Lou's mother left for the evening and locked Mary Lou in. She said Mary Lou had already gotten into bed. Neighbors reported hearing screams that night, some just after 10 and others reported closer to midnight, but they must have written them off. Mary Lou's mother said that she did see the bedroom light go on and blinds pulled open late into the evening that night, but she didn't receive a phone call from Mary Lou, so she didn't think too much more about it. When she arrived on the morning of February 6th at around 6 a.m., she found the house locked. She knocked for Mary Lou to let her in, but was met without answer. Since she was locked out, she broke a back window to get in, and then that's when she found a scene no mother should ever have to see. Her daughter was sprawled out on the floor, a cord wrapped around her neck tightly. Her mother tried to undo the cord and save her daughter, but it was too late. Mary Lou Jenkins had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. She was found partially clothed in what appeared to be the clothes she slept in and a housecoat over it, indicating that maybe she tossed on a robe to respond to a knock at the door. Because there were no signs of forced entry, detectives suspected that she knew her killer and willingly let them in. But they came up empty. Facing pressure from the community to find the killer, police seized an opportunity close to the case a few weeks later. A black man named Floyd Cochran had been experiencing a mental health crisis for the last 6 months, according to his doctors and those closest to him. His doctor said that he had come to him and said he had been unable to sleep and that he was fearful that Hitler was going to hurt him. Floyd's sisters claimed recently when he had visited with his wife, he shared that his wife was trying to poison him. Another sibling said that on a visit he had made obscene hand gestures, and when his wife asked him to stop, he just giggled. His siblings had been considering getting him committed to a mental institution because of the decline since September of 1945. Ultimately, that wouldn't happen soon enough, and the results would end in tragedy. In late February 1946, just a few weeks after Mary Lou Jenkins' murder, Floyd Cochran shot his wife in a moment of paranoia during a domestic dispute. Arrested for that crime, police began to heavily interrogate him for the murder of Mary Lou Jenkins. He was a trash hauler in her neighborhood. They interrogated him for hours upon hours upon hours, and he kept denying any involvement. They kept him awake for 2 straight nights and interrogated him without an attorney present. His confession all came down to 60 cents. One piece of evidence early on in the case was missing 60 cents. Mary Lou's mother, Dorothy, insisted that when she had left her daughter that evening, her daughter had $5.40 in her purse. But the next morning, after she was found dead, there was only $4.80. She said, "I don't know why 60 cents was missing. We didn't owe anybody 60 cents. When interrogating Floyd, they used this to break him down deep into the interrogation. Since Floyd picked up trash alongside his parents for work, into the interview they told Floyd that his parents believed in his innocence in the murder of his wife and that his parents' belief had influenced them to believe it too. But they said, the only mistake you made was keeping 60 cents from your parents. You owed that to your parents, and they told us to ask you about it, the 60 cents for the Jenkins job. Worn down, Floyd responded, quote, "Tell them I've got it and then let me go," end quote. With that, they pounced. Eventually, Floyd said that he had gone there that night to collect the money the Jenkins owed him for the trash pickup. He said she paid it to him and then he just snapped because she was so pretty. And with that, he was charged with her murder. Despite recanting his confession and his father even providing an alibi for him on the night of the crime, Floyd Cochran was found guilty and sentenced to death. His team tried to appeal this judgment, citing the fact that beyond his mental illness, he also had what appeared to be an intellectual disability. He had even been rejected from the World War II draft because of his intellectual capacity, and he was said to be aligned with that of about a 10-year-old. Governor Phil Donnelly had delayed his execution so that he could undergo a mental examination, but they determined that he knew right from wrong, and thus that was enough for them to uphold the death penalty. A death that was carried out by the state of Missouri just months later. On September 26, 1947, He became the only man from Boone County to ever die in the gas chamber. Reporters at the time documented that he seemed confused as to what was happening. He was blindfolded and tied down to a chair in a 6-foot by 10-foot chamber. Onlookers reported that the last thing he said softly was that he asked for the warden, Ben B. Stewart. He simply said in a quiet voice, "Mr. Stewart?" And those words were his last. Satisfied that they had the perpetrator caught and justice was served, the Columbia community moved on. That was until a series of assaults and attempted assaults began occurring in the same neighborhood as Mary Lou Jenkins' murder in the fall of 1949. And I'm talking just within yards of her murder site. On October 29, 1949, a 16-year-old was babysitting at the home of Mr. and Mrs. John Cousins at 810 Sunset Lane, just a quarter-mile away from where Janett Christman would be murdered less than 5 months later. She had not locked the door, and suddenly a man appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a Halloween-type disguise, as it was described, and a white-type hood. He worked fast, turning off the lights, blindfolding the girl with a bandana, and sexually assaulting her. The victim reported that he would choke her anytime she fought back. Almost a month later, an 18-year-old named Sally Johnson was attacked in her home in the same neighborhood. She lived with her parents and her grandmother. Her parents' car was gone, so it appeared she was home alone, but her grandmother was home with her. She dozed off on the couch of her house, where it was unlocked at the time. In an instant, an intruder opened the door, donning a white mask. He grabbed Sally, who started screaming and fighting back. Her grandmother heard the noise and ran downstairs, yelling and saying she was calling the police. The intruder dragged Sally to the back porch and all the way outside, but she was able to kick him and break free to run inside. Rather than continue to pursue her, he ran away off the back deck. The very next night, a college couple was spending time together in a car on a lover's lane. A man approached them in a white hood, pulled out a gun, and walked with them several yards away. He tied up the couple, sexually assaulted the woman, and then untied them and took them back to the car. Police again brought in a variety of potential suspects, but they were mostly black men who they had arrested for other crimes or whom they considered to be troublemakers. Sally Johnson had said she was fairly certain the person who committed her attempted rape was a black man, but she couldn't be positive. She thought it could be a dark-skinned white man too. But they felt they found their man when they caught someone named Jake Bradford Jr. in the act of looking in a window. The neighborhood was not the same neighborhood as the crimes were occurring in, from what I could find in my research, though not too far. And before I go too far into this, I want to take a clear stance that Jake Bradford engaging in peeping Tom behavior is both wrong and dangerous. It's an invasion of privacy for the victim, and it's highly regarded as a stepping stone behavior for sexual violence. But we aren't here specifically determining if Jake Bradford Jr. would escalate to sexual assault. We're here to determine if he committed these 3 assaults, the rapes and the attempted rape, in the same neighborhood. Apparently, there were a few other attempted rapes in this neighborhood, though I couldn't find any other additional details on them. Jake Bradford Jr. was a 26-year-old black man from a large family who had been in trouble with the law before, beginning in 1941. He was first charged with stealing a bicycle, then for obtaining money under false pretenses, then for destroying property at the Missouri Theater building, and then for stealing a watch. The Peeping Tom incident was the first indication of any sexual behavior, and it's unclear if that's what he was actually doing. The motive could have been to stake out a house for robbery, for all we know, which again, I want to reiterate, is a crime and is wrong. Much like Floyd Cochran, police held Bradford in jail for days, almost a week in fact, and interrogated him relentlessly. He too was found to possibly have an intellectual disability. Reports at the time kept referring to him in degrading and outdated language, but essentially stating he could borderline be considered as having an intellectual disability. At one point, the coroner was reported to have waved a gun near him, frightening Jake Bradford. Then, almost a week in, interrogators implied to him that a mob outside the jail already believed he was guilty and that he would not be safe if he were to go outside. After days of interrogation without a lawyer present, he broke. Fearful of his safety on the outside, he asked the officers if he confessed if they would protect him, to which they said they would. It was then that he confessed to both crimes. Jake Bradford Jr. was in jail awaiting trial when Janett Christman was brutally sexually assaulted and murdered within blocks of the similar crimes he was charged with. That is when the community realized they were in a heap of trouble. What if this young man in jail was not responsible? Worse, what if the person who killed Janett was also the person who killed Mary Lou years earlier? Had they executed an innocent man? Police had to look into who Janett Christman would open the door for, given the fact that they believed the break-in to be staged, and one name just kept floating on their radar. Remember Robert Mueller, the father of the children Janett also used to babysit for? Robert had attended the same party as the Romacks that night and played cards. Robert Mueller and Ed Romack were longtime friends. But Romack left the event after just an hour, saying he had to meet a doctor who was tending to his sick child. He was gone for 2 hours and then returned to the party. But when they asked the doctor, he claimed that he and Robert Mueller never connected. Caught in a lie, he said he just drove around that night and offered up that, "I know I don't have an alibi, but I don't have any scratches or anything either," which was kind of weird because nobody asked him that specifically. The morning after the murder, he allegedly called Ed Romack at his father's house where he was staying and offered to, quote, "come clean up the mess." But Ed wasn't sure how he would know there was a mess, as the murder had not been publicized yet. Mueller specified a specific radio station his mother had heard it on, but when investigators looked into that, there had been no such mention of a, quote, mess. It seemed Ed Romack was growing suspicious of his longtime friend. He shared that when they were younger, they used to double date a lot, and that Robert Mueller would have a hard time getting a second date. He said there was just something weird about Bob Mueller. Mrs. Romack agreed and stated that she had been at the receiving end of sexualized behavior from Robert Mueller. He would often come to the home when she was there alone, and she stated that 2 days prior to the murder, he had shown up under the pretenses of helping her to hem a dress. For some context here, Robert Mueller had come back to Columbia after serving in the Army in World War II and worked for his father's local business, Mueller's Virginia Cafe, as well as working as a tailor. So that's why he'd be helping her alter a dress. After getting inside for that reason, it was then that he rubbed his hand over the dress in the area of her breasts and told her it was a nice dress. He then pulled out his mechanical pencil and began clicking it in his hand, making some comment about not having his keys to play around with. Uncomfortable but trying to remain cool-headed, Mrs. Romack suggested that she make some coffee, to which he said he didn't have time to wait for, so she asked him to leave. Both Mr. and Mrs. Romack shared that Robert Mueller had made uncomfortable comments about Janett Christman, apparently saying he admired her curvy and mature figure. The following is the question and answer interview investigators had with Ed Romack about Robert Mueller. Question: did Robert Mueller talk about girls? Answer: yes. Question: did you and he date any girls? Answer: yes, but he had difficulty in obtaining the second date with girls, and later girls refused to date him at Stevens College. Question: what was his difficulty? Answer: I do not know, he just seemed odd. Question: did he make any remarks about girls? Answer: yes, he always talked about getting a virgin girl. Question: was this after he was married? Answer: yes. Question: when was the last time he talked to you about a virgin girl? Answer: Saturday, April 15th, 1950. Robert Mueller talked to me at his home and said this would be a good night to go down to Hinkson Creek and get a nice young girl. Question: what was your reply? Answer: I just looked at him. Ed Romack was clearly uncomfortable about his friend's behavior, and so was his wife. Here is the same detective having an exchange with Ann Romack, questioning her about Robert Mueller. Question: why would Robert Mueller pull his pencil out of his pocket and move his hands all around? Answer: he would become passionate. Question: if he was successful in overpowering you, would he be in a position to have intercourse with you? Answer: definitely. He is oversexed. Question: did Robert Mueller repair a seam on your dress? Answer: no, he never did try. Question: did Robert Mueller molest you on other occasions when he visited your home alone? Answer: yes, on most occasions in the privacy of my home. The detective then asked her about if she had told her husband about Robert Mueller's actions and advancements towards her, and she answered, yes, I would try to tell him in a mild way, and he would look at me and laugh. Question: what do you mean by a mild way? Answer: my husband and Robert Mueller were close friends. Question: at this time, do you fear Robert Mueller? Answer: yes. Question: why? Answer: he was the only one that was acquainted with our home and made regular visits. Question: is there any other reason of fear? Answer: yes. Question: what are the reasons? Answer: his actions around me, he admiring Janett Christman, and my own life. Ann Romack also said that Robert Mueller read detective stories and would go on about how if he ever committed any crimes, he would establish an alibi and figure out a way that he would get away scot-free. The mechanical pencil he carried matched the wounds on Janett Christman. His behavior before and after the murder was creepy, but it wasn't immediate for Ed Romack to consider his longtime friend a suspect. It took time for him to start to piece together things over time, and quite possibly the creepiest fact of this case comes next. Apparently, in the days following the murder, Ed Romack was talking to Robert Mueller about the crime, obviously traumatized from the event. He shared with Robert how he was confused about the garden hoe and the broken window and the light being on in the shotgun, and suddenly Robert shared his own theory of how the crime took place. He said, "There's no way a person would shatter a window to enter. That would be too noisy. It would be much easier to just knock at the door and say, 'Ed sent me here to get poker chips.'" There was a heap of circumstantial evidence against Mueller, and investigators pulled it together to interrogate him. But they didn't follow standard interrogation protocol, a common theme here in this episode. Rather than bring him to the police station, they escorted him to a private farm home outside the city limits and interrogated him for hours overnight without a lawyer. The next day, they brought him for a polygraph exam, which he passed. Polygraph tests were super new at this time. Some of the original reporting I read was explaining in the 1950s newspaper what a polygraph even was. And so it was super flawed still. And you have to remember, polygraphs rely on the skills of the person administering the test and their ability to give and interpret a quality test, which is why, even though they've come a long way, they're still considered junk science in the eyes of the court. But with the past polygraph test, they felt they had to release him. But because of all the compiled evidence, the court judge W.M. Dimwittle felt the need to arrange a grand jury to investigate Mueller with this case. But the police incompetence in their investigation and interrogation of him proved to be too much of a hurdle to overcome, and charges could never be brought. In fact, Mueller attempted to sue several members of law enforcement and the Romacks for libel for $300,000, but he lost the suit. Shortly after the murder, Mueller joined the Air Force and relocated with his family to Tucson, Arizona. Coincidentally, the attacks in the Columbia neighborhood stopped. For a moment, let's return to Jake Bradford Jr. Despite the overwhelming evidence that the person who committed the crimes he was on trial for also committed Janett Christman's murder, which he couldn't have committed, the courts carried on with their case. He would first go on trial for the attempted assault of Sally Johnson. There were all sorts of issues with his confession. Bradford claimed the confession itself was coerced. When detectives brought him to the neighborhood of the Johnson crime for reenactment after his confession, he couldn't even identify the Johnson home. When they fed him the answer to where the home was, he picked the wrong door for entry and talked about only dragging her to a threshold from the dinette area and the porch. The hood he claimed to have worn would have covered his whole face, and Sally said her attacker only had his face covered from the nose down. She also couldn't definitively identify Jake Bradford as the attacker. Still, he was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years for attempted rape. He then stood trial for the rape of the 16-year-old babysitter. The problematic confession was deemed permissible again, and he was also convicted of this crime and sentenced to 50 years in prison. His defense attorney, Harry Limerick, appealed for a new trial all the way up to the Supreme Court. He stated the original confession was involuntary. He identified 39 errors in the original trial. He argued that Bradford had been threatened with mob violence. He brought up the incident with the coroner and the gun. He brought up the lack of identification from the victim pointing in the direction of him. And lastly, he brought up that he also likely had an intellectual disability. The appeal made it up to the Supreme Court twice, first being denied and then succeeding with overturning the verdict. With the Supreme Court weighing in the second time in 1953, they kicked the case back to the Circuit Court. This time, prosecutors decided not to pursue the charges again, and on January 13, 1954, Jake Bradford Jr. was set free. At the time of this recording, it's been 74 years since Janett Christman's life was snuffed out as she worked hard to earn extra money. She loved playing piano and sang in the choir. She loved her family and caring for her newborn sister. She was considered mature for her age and a hard worker. We will likely never know what happened that night, and I normally don't give my theories, but for this case I will. I believe that she let Robert Mueller into her home because he showed up with the exact phrase he told Ed Romack about the poker chips. I believe he attacked her, and when he went to go cut the ironing cord, she was free long enough to dial for help. But then he caught her there and carried out the assault and murder. It's the only explanation I could find for having the time to dial the number on a rotary phone. And the Romacks confirmed he knew where they kept their iron. I also believe that he was responsible for the other assaults. The peeping Tom, or rather the incident where the back door was tried a half hour before, maybe when he was driving around, he first attempted another assault, but then decided to give into his urge to assault the babysitter who he had long lusted over, which is disgusting, but I think a distinct possibility. The Christman family and Romack family both believed that Robert Mueller was responsible for Janett's murder and possibly the nearby attacks, but Robert Mueller never did face any consequences if he did. He died at 83 years old in 2006, still living in Arizona. The Romacks left Missouri and moved to Idaho Falls. Anne passed away in the 1980s, and Ed passed away at age 93 in 2016. Their son Gregory grew up and led a successful life in Alaska. Charles Christman passed away in 1974 at just 60 years old. Lula moved the family to Kansas City until her passing in 2009. Janett's surviving sisters went on to marry and start new lives, having never gotten answers or closure in their sister's murder, and without having their sister present for big moments in their lives. The safety and security of this small city was uprooted during this time. Friendships were lost. A possibly innocent man was executed for a crime he likely didn't commit. Those who were attacked or raped had to pick up and build a new normal, having survived something so traumatizing. And police leaned into ethically poor behavior that resulted in targeting likely innocent black men, and that same behavior allowed a likely guilty white man to get away with it. So next time you think of the 1950s as a family-oriented, safe utopia, I want you to remember the terror that this little community in Missouri felt and all the lives it touched along the way. If Janett Christman were still alive today, she would be 88 years old, and she deserved to age and live a full life. May she rest in peace. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. Thank you so much for joining me for my 30th episode. I couldn't have gotten this far without your support, and I can't wait to bring you even more in the weeks and months and years to come. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review and share this podcast with a friend. Word of mouth recommendations are truly the best way to spread the word and get these cold cases out there to more listeners. You can follow this podcast on Instagram at Simpler Time Crime Pod, as well as TikTok and Facebook and YouTube. Case suggestions can be made to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Join me next Monday for another cold case, and as always, thank you so much for listening.